From WisPolitics in Madison, you're listening to Capital Chats.
Hello, everybody. This is Kate Morton with WisPolitics here with a Capital Chats podcast brought to you by Spectrum. Today, I'm here with my colleague Abigail Lovins to talk about an interview she did with former Governor Scott Walker. So, Abigail, what did you guys talk about in the interview?
Yeah, Scott Walker and I talked a bit about the Supreme Court election, his legacy as governor, and what he thinks the future of the Republican Party looks like.
Great. Well, let's hear what he had to say.
Thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Mind if I jump right into the questions?
Please, that'd be great.
Okay, first off, I want to talk about your organization, the Young America's Foundation that you're president of. And I know you were recently in Madison to deliver a talk with them. And I'm curious, as president, what insight has this given you about where conservative youth are at and what the future of the Republican Party is?
Yeah, in terms of conservatives, it's been interesting. We do a lot of polling, even though we're not a political organization. We work in education and ideas, so we're kind of right of center. We talk about individual liberties, free enterprise, traditional American values, strong national defense, things that I talked about all throughout my public life. And it's been interesting in our polling. We did it both before the election and since the inauguration, and we found that the last few years in particular, there's been a huge shift. Number one issue all throughout the last several polls, both before the election and since President Trump took office, has overwhelmingly been the economy and high prices. So we see a renewed focus there. And we've seen even on some social issues. So not at all what many in the national media perceive young people at. But for example, we ask about men and women's sports. Almost 2/3 of younger voters said they didn't think that was fair. And we ask about things like race as a factor in employment or even enrollment in college. Younger voters overwhelmingly said they didn't think that was fair. And so it's interesting. The other big takeaway that we took is when we asked where young people were at on the political spectrum, what we found was that we asked conservative, liberal, somewhere in between. The reality was that overwhelmingly, the number one answer was that they were not conservative, not shocking, but not liberal, that they were moderates. And what that tells me, and what I saw that again, even at the questions the other day at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was that most young people, like most voters in a state like Wisconsin, are just trying to figure it out. They're just trying to figure out what the truth is, where the facts are, plus just live their lives. And so to the extent that groups like Young America's Foundation and others like us can get to those students and offer them alternative to what they've heard, so much the better.
Shifting more into a focus on the state party, looking back on the Supreme Court election and how the state party is feeling after that, what do you feel is the next step for the state of Wisconsin Republican Party?
Well, just personally, not through my work at Young America's Foundation, but personally, I think there's a huge void. One of the things I give Ben Winkler, the soon-to-be outgoing chair of the state Democrats, credit for is he's done a remarkable job just politically of making the case that that people nationally should be giving him money, and you see it through people like Reid Hoffman, J.D. Pritzker, George Soros, and others, and that he's got a game plan to take that money and give it. In this case, whether it was to a Supreme Court candidate, in the past it was to a gubernatorial candidate, other candidates, because of state law, they can collect that without limits, and they can pass it on to the candidate, and the candidates can accept that without limits. And so it's a huge influx of money, but it doubles up because what we saw in the last few weeks of the Supreme Court election is not only was this money flowing in from the party to the candidates that Ben Winkler and others were raising, but that by law, the requirements are that the candidate gets the lowest cost per ad. And so it wasn't just matching dollar for dollar, that every dollar they spent on the campaign in an ad was in some cases close to double the impact what the dollars were in outside groups. And so I think the big takeaway, at least for me, was message, manpower, and money. Those are the three M's. Those are the things that always win elections. You got to have a powerful message. You've got to have manpower. You got to have the grassroots. But if you can't match the money, the Republican Party here in Wisconsin is going to be behind the eight ball for quite some time until they figure out a way to balance what state Democrats have done over the last few years.
Yeah, and in this last election, Brad Schimmel certainly did receive a lot of money from Elon Musk, and some people are saying that that involvement was not a good call. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a good example of where the people who gave money to the party for the Democrats were just smart to keep their mouth quiet because a whole lot more money went to Susan Crawford from billionaires from outside of the state. In fact, I think the Journal Sentinel did a number and said that 77% of her funding came from outside of the state of Wisconsin versus just 15% for Brad Schimmel. And yet, even in your question, even today, weeks after, we're still talking about Musk, even though his was a fraction of the outside money that came from across the country. I think it's just a good reminder of why it's much, much better to do it through the party. It's much better than doing it through outside groups or drawing personal attention, but rather focusing on money that legally in Wisconsin to either major political party can go without limits to the party, and then that money can be given to candidates. That's the lesson learned going forward.
Sure. And following the Supreme Court race, now the Wisconsin Supreme Court is guaranteed a liberal majority, at least until 2 years from now. And I think a big case that's before them is Act 10, and that was a significant part of your legacy as governor. What are your thoughts on the possibility of that being overturned?
Well, if the worst of scenarios, this is already determined law. Remember, the last 2 years, there's been a liberal majority, 4-3 on the side of liberals. The difference was Ann Walsh Bradley, the justice who's retiring, even though she was liberal, had been on the court for more than a quarter century, and she believed in precedent. I hope there'll at least be a few on the court that still carry that belief that things shouldn't just go back and forth depending on elections, but should actually be decided what the facts are legally. And in that case, the facts have already been upheld by the state Supreme Court. They've already been upheld by federal courts. That Act 10 was indeed constitutional. Unfortunately, we saw after the election 2 years ago, some of the big government union bosses literally shopped around, filed a suit days after the latest justice was sworn into the court, and went and sought the best court, which was in Dane County, got a judge who actually signed the recall petition. I mean, talk about conflict after conflict, and has now suggested that they're going to keep moving forward. That judge at the circuit court level ruled that at least part of Act 10 was unconstitutional. That's been held up in the appellate process. I would imagine the Court of Appeals would overturn that, and then it'll be up to the state Supreme Court. If they overturn it after it has been upheld previous times before, it'll set a horrible standard, not so much just for Act 10, but for any law, with the idea being that law shouldn't go back or forth depending on an election. Law should be determined based upon the Constitution and the rule of law. And I'm still hopeful, although very concerned that that will happen. And oh, by the way, if that did happen, the other thing that people I don't think fully recognize is it would be devastating for people all across the state. If Act 10 were to be thrown out, not only would property taxes very likely go up, and we've saved literally tens of billions of dollars since Act 10 was first enacted, but I think what a lot of people don't realize is the biggest losers would be students. They would be schools. They would be people who seek municipal and county services, because that money would be taken away from the classroom, taken away from those services, and put into union contracts without a way to replace them. And so it would have a double negative, both higher property taxes and the loss of services and programs in the classroom and elsewhere.
Sure. And shifting out of state politics for a second and up to national politics, Donald Trump has been in office nearly 100 days now. How do you think he's doing?
Well, I think on substance, it's been spectacular. I mean, we look at what, I think that part of the reason why he's doing reasonably well in the polls is because so many Americans, people here in Wisconsin, across the country, get frustrated with politicians who promise a bunch of things and don't deliver them. Whether you agree or disagree with everything he's done or even every way he's done it, the one thing that I think is overwhelmingly clear is that President Donald Trump has kept his word. He talked about making border security a priority. He has done that. He's talked about getting violent criminals out of this country. We're in the midst of, obviously, many great debates and discussions about that. He's talked about taking action to try and clean up the mess in Washington and to cut out wasteful government, the whole Department of Government Efficiency, waste, fraud, and abuse. Those are things he said he would do. And those are things, I think, to the shock of many, he's actually done, which is large part why you see such negative reaction by many on the left and even some in the national media, is because they didn't think he would do it all. To me, one of the oddest blessings that I don't think any of us saw coming was him having a gap of those 4 years. I actually think put him and his team he's assembled in a much better position to actually get things done. And that's been overwhelmingly positive.
And one of the things he's done is tariffs, and there's been a lot of back and forth on what that actually looks like. What do you make of the impact on Wisconsin? I know Ron Johnson and some of the other delegates have expressed concerns about this. What do you make of it?
Well, I love free trade. I talked about it when I was at the University of Wisconsin. I'd love to have no tariffs, and I actually think that's Donald Trump's ultimate goal. He said that in front of the G7 years ago when I talked to him on the way up to meeting in Canada with the other industrialized nations. He actually offered to get rid of all tariffs on any of their goods in return for them doing the same. Now, obviously, they didn't take him up on that, but I think that's his end game. I think it's just part of an incredible strategy. I point out to the students, anyone who's read The Art of the Deal knows this is how he negotiates. And so for all the hype and hysteria about tariffs, and again, I'm a free trade guy, I actually think he's moved us a giant step closer to, if not zero, at least low-level tariffs, which will be good for farmers and manufacturers and others here in the state of Wisconsin. But he's done so by really aggressively drawing attention to the fact that we don't, before he came in, we didn't have free trade. For all the talk about his tariffs, there were plenty of tariffs. They were just on our stuff, not the other way around. And so he brought nations from around the world to the table. I'm optimistic that this pause will get many, if not all of them, who talked about negotiating into a much better free trade agreement with the United States. And obviously, the one he's left as a target is China. But the Communist Chinese Party has been brutal, particularly here in the Midwest, the industrial Midwest, when you think of the challenges they put on American workers and manufacturing and agriculture. And my hope is that he'll play strong, just as Ronald Reagan took on the old Soviet Union, the communists there, that Donald Trump will do the same with China, and that in the end, we'll get them to get back to a better, fair level of trade.
So you think in the end it'll benefit Wisconsin?
Oh yeah, if you get not only to fair trade or free trade, but to fair trade, where we're on a level playing field, I think our workers and our farmers can compete against anyone. The problem we have in the world right now is so many other countries put tariffs on our goods, and that's what President Trump had enough of. And so, if we can get to a point where we're level, we do well. I remember that G7 event I talked about. Part of the reason I was talking to President Trump in 2018 about this was Canada, even though they're our number one trading partner, even though they're in this trade deal that they were working out, Canada put all sorts of tariffs on certain types of milk. And that was because there's a really heavy political body in Ontario that's into protecting the dairy industry there. Well, that put our dairy farmers on the downside of things. And I told him, I said, we want to level the playing field. We can compete. We've got great workers, we've got great farmers, we've got incredible innovations, but we want a level playing field.
Sure. And I want to shift back to discussion about the Wisconsin governor race for next year that a lot of people are talking about. And there's been talk going around that you aren't really planning on running. Is that the case? And if so, is there anyone in particular you'd like to see run?
Yeah, as much as people joke about the 45, 47, as President Trump was the 45th president, now the 47th, I was the 45th governor. So, but no, I'm not making any plans in 26. I love what I'm doing at Young America's Foundation. I want to continue to work with young people and move them in the right direction. But having said that, I often joke, I am a quarter century younger than Joe Biden. So I've got plenty of time to think about that in the future. My hope would be that one of these names, or maybe even someone we haven't heard of yet, who's a good, solid conservative, will rise to the top and get elected next November. If that's the case, and 4 years later, I'd be happy to support him or her in her or his reelection. Right now, it remains to be seen. I'm not going to get involved in the primary. 4 years ago, I did because Rebecca Clayfish, who had served as my lieutenant governor, was fabulous, and I was happy to back her. But right now, I'm focused on my work. Certainly, Tonette and I live right here where I'm standing and on Pewaukee Lake in the town of Delafield. And so we're very, very interested, very, very concerned about the future of the state. We want to make sure there's a better governor than the failure we've had. I mean, somebody who keeps pushing massive tax increases, who does ridiculous things like put things in his budget for inseminated persons, things that just make Wisconsin a national laughingstock. We don't need any more of that. We don't need more of the failure of Tony Evers. In fact, had he gotten what he wanted, thank God there's Republicans in the legislature to block most of his nonsense. But so we need a better governor. But to me, we'll wait and see who wins the primary. There's a number of people I would imagine, not only the names that have been kicked around, I'd be surprised if Eric Hovde wasn't thinking about it. We just saw Bill Berrien offer up a super PAC. You saw the Washington County executive, Josh, is thinking about it. You have others talking about it. Tom Tiffany, who serves in Congress, my friend who'd been in the legislature when I was there. There's a lot of names being bantered around. I don't have a preference that I'm going to get involved in, other than I just think we need a better governor than Tony Evers.
Sure, and you mentioned your future is still up in the air. Right now, you like the Young America's Foundation. Would you consider a run for a political office again in the future?
Well, like I say never. I don't think I'd wait 25 years to on the age that Joe Biden was when he ran, but I think I'm in no rush. There's plenty of work to be done. I've made a multi-year commitment to work with young people here in Wisconsin, across the country. But clearly, I have a distinction I wish I didn't have. I'm the only Republican elected governor in Wisconsin this century, and I'd like to see that change. But in a few years, if somehow we don't win next year, maybe I'll look at things differently the next time there's a seat for governor. But now my hope is that we'll elect a new governor. I won't have to worry about it.
Sure. Well, Scott, that's all the questions I have for you today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
All right, Abigail, thank you for sharing that interview with us. In the meantime, if our listeners want to learn more about state politics in Wisconsin, they can head to our website at wispolitics.com. But for now, I'm Kate Morton.
And I'm Abigail Evans.
Thanks for tuning in to WisPolitics Capital Chats, brought to you by Spectrum.